Hey there, POTA team. I'm Matt, N3NWV, and we've got a fun one today. Today we're going to talk about building your man-portable POTA station. Before we get into it, here's the inevitable asterisk. This information is suggestions, lessons learned from people who have gone before you, maybe just some ideas or examples. There are no hard and fast rules that say here's what your station has to be. As long as what you want to do is safe and isn't going to tear up the park, go for it. Give it a shot. One of the goals of POTA is to get you out there and trying new stuff. So don't feel like you are somehow constrained by anything you see in this video. And then the flip side of that is don't feel like you have to live up to anything in this video. Very, very modest stations can be very effective. This is a hobby after all, and everybody's situation is different. So just like these aren't rules, they're not requirements either. You've got a station put together, no matter what it is, take it out and try it. You may be surprised at what you can accomplish with very little. Before we get into talking about the station you're going to build, let's talk about one of the most effective stations that you might already have, and that's a mobile rig. Mobile stations do a couple of things that other types of stations can't do. If your radio happens to be permanently installed in the car, then it's a zero setup time operation. As soon as you pull into the park, you're ready to operate. Mobile stations are also by far the stealthiest of the ways to activate POTA. You're sitting in the parking lot, talking to yourself, you might look a little strange, but odds are you're not going to bother anybody. And then there's the weather. A mobile station is also a mobile shelter, probably with heat and air conditioning. They're viable in all sorts of conditions that keep us park bench dwellers tucked away safely at home. There's absolutely nothing that says your mobile station has to be complicated either. That phone holder lives in this van 24/7, and the radio just sits on the passenger seat, plugs into the 12-volt socket of the dash when I want to use it. I can't run 100 watts, but it takes me 4 seconds to set it up. And for an antenna, all I've got is a monoband ham stick on a magnetic mount. As it turns out, it's not a bad hunting rig either. November 3, November, Whiskey Victoria. Clearly, there are lots of upsides to operating out of whatever sort of buggy got you to the park. But there are also upsides to getting out of your car, getting out amongst the trees and the picnic tables, and really being in the park while doing your POTA activation. In order to completely cut the cord, you're going to have to solve a couple of problems. And the first of those is how are you going to power your radio and whatever else you brought with you? Believe it or not, every now and again you'll stumble into good old-fashioned AC mains power. The occasional park pavilion will have an outlet that's active. You might want to check and make sure you're allowed to use it, but it might be there. And then, of course, if you are paying for space in a park, cabin, campground, something like that, you may find out what sort of facilities they have available even before you get there. Or alternatively, generators are a way to provide your own AC power. Personally, not a big fan. I think generators are heavy, much less reliable than many other options we have available to us, and the most likely thing you can do to irritate somebody else in the park. But if you're in a campground and trying to run an entire RV or something along with your ham radio, you may not have a choice. Far and away the most common solution to this problem for POTA activators is battery power. With the advent of new lithium chemistries, batteries have gotten a lot more charge dense with a lot less weight, and in many respects far safer than our old lead-acid friends. How much battery power you're going to need depends on the RF power you intend to run, how long you intend to be out there, and whether or not you'll be supplementing the battery power with either charging from the wall, your car, or the sun. For most aspects of portable operation, less is more. But in the power arena, that's not necessarily the case. It really, really stinks to be out there having a great time on your POTA activation only to have your battery go flat. So plan ahead and then add a little extra. There's good news on the radio front. There's really no need to stress over what rig you're operating. Short of trying to power vacuum tubes from batteries, any radio that functions will work just fine for POTA. If you are looking to pick up a radio, you'll find that the features that come in handy for POTA are features that just generally come in handy on a radio. Of the ones listed here, the built-in tuner is probably the most useful for POTA because you might find that that antenna that you tuned perfectly at home isn't quite as perfect when you deploy it in a different spot in the park. And except for the fact that you have to bring the batteries to supply it, in general, more power, more better. But remember that it's what makes it out of the antenna that counts. So make sure your power amplifier is where you should start your optimizations. The most important point when it comes to selecting a radio is to select one that you will actually use outdoors, where there are bugs and kids and antennas that could fall over when the wind blows in that big dark cloud. I have unfortunately seen too many hams who brought a rig they dearly loved with them on an activation and then spent the whole time worried about the radio instead of having fun making contacts. That's not a very fun way to spend a day, so make sure you're honest with yourself about your tolerance for things going wrong when you're deciding where to invest what. The last piece of kit you're absolutely positively going to need is some kind of an antenna, and this is probably the liveliest area of discussion in most POTA circles. There are lots of choices for antennas when you're operating portable, and there is no such thing as the perfect antenna. If there were, we would all be using it, and quite frankly, that would be pretty dull. Of course, the RF performance of an antenna is always important, but when you're talking portable, and specifically POTA, there are some other considerations that are going to come up. Which ones of these are most important to you is going to depend an awful lot on both your personality and the types of parks in which you tend to operate. For some operators, footprint is absolutely key. They're operating in crowded parks or national parks, particularly here on the East Coast, where they have a sort of limited tolerance for how much space and how many wires you're going to string up where. For other operators, it's all about the setup and tear down time. They're chasing radar awards, or they're trying to sneak in an activation after work before it gets dark, and they'd really rather be on the radio than setting up the radio. In terms of what antennas people are actually using out in the field, they fall roughly into two camps. Camp number one is the self-contained, self-supporting antenna crowd. These are things like the Wolf River coil, the buddy pole, and the various forms of the magnetic loop. Big advantages to this group of antennas is that they have a relatively low footprint. They are in most cases pretty quick to set up and tear down, and they are almost all tunable antennas, meaning you don't have to have a tuner in the radio. The downsides to this batch of antennas is that they tend to be far less efficient than some of the other resonant antenna designs, and they also tend to be some of the most expensive antennas in circulation. The other group is the wire antenna crowd. Now this covers a whole lot of designs, from end feds to quarter wave verticals to every shape and manner of dipole you can imagine. People like wire antennas because they tend to be naturally resonant, meaning that they're good performers and there's a lot less worry of melting your coil or arcing over your capacitor due to too much power. Wire antennas also tend to be pretty simple to build out of materials that are pretty easy to get. So with even minimal DIY skills, you can come up with a pretty good antenna without spending much money. The problem here is that in order to get your inexpensive yet efficient antenna operational, you have to get it up in the air somehow. That's going to require you to bring a big fishing pole or a fiberglass mast or a kite or a balloon or something to get your antenna in the air. The other option that can work sometimes is the use of trees, but definitely check with your park officials before you plan on going this route. It's not okay everywhere. Same goes for driving stakes in the ground. This is straight up illegal in some places, so make sure you know the rules before you start doing it. POTA has a leave no trace philosophy, and that is our expectation for activators operating under the program. So as you can see, you have a number of choices for equipment and how you're going to deploy that equipment once you get to the park. Those choices are going to determine your station footprint, which is going to determine how much work it is for you and your impacts to the park and the other people at that park. As usual, there aren't any absolute right or wrongs here. Just make sure that what you're doing for your station is appropriate for you and your capabilities, as well as for the park that you're headed to. It's always a good idea to try out a new station configuration in your own backyard, where it doesn't really matter if you forgot a piece and you can tell exactly what your footprint is going to be. But in the end, there's no better teacher than experience. And the station that you've got on the air at the park always makes more QSOs than the better one that you're still working on at home. So get out there and do it. And if you learn something, great. But most importantly, have fun.